Sí, buenas tardes. Buenas tardes a todos y muchas gracias de nuevo. Yo creo que hoy está siendo una jornada apasionante hablando de los temas de equidad, género, la vulnerabilidad asociada al cambio climático, y tenemos ahora pues unos ponentes de excepción para hablarnos de un tema que además es verdaderamente importante, que tiene que ver con las migraciones y el cambio climático, el problema de los desplazados climáticos, y tenemos la suerte de contar con la secretaria de Estado de Migraciones, Consuelo Rumí, a quien doy la palabra para que ella presente a los ponentes. Muchas gracias, secretaria de Estado.
Muchas gracias. Pues buenas tardes a todos y bienvenido a esta sesión sobre migraciones y cambio climático, que forma parte de la programación de la zona azul de la Cumbre del Clima, un encuentro internacional en el que se está poniendo de manifiesto la gravedad de una situación que requiere el compromiso de todos si queremos subsanar los desastres ambientales que hemos cometido en las últimas décadas. Se da la circunstancia de que los países más vulnerables son los más perjudicados por el cambio climático, pero a su vez son los menos industrializados y los menos responsables en la emisión de gases de efecto invernadero. El cambio climático está agravando la brecha de la desigualdad, una injusticia que se advierte especialmente en el caso de los desplazamientos forzosos provocados por la emergencia climática. El Banco Mundial estima que en los próximos 30 años el cambio climático expulsará de sus hogares a más de 140 millones de personas si no se toman medidas para evitarlo. Mitigar los efectos del cambio climático es una necesidad ineludible que requiere el compromiso de todos, pero muy especialmente de los principales emisores de gases. Es necesario movilizar recursos, también inteligencia y también compromiso, desde el convencimiento de que la suma de esfuerzos multiplicará los resultados. Aunque en el marco jurídico internacional de las migraciones sigue sin estar suficientemente contemplada la situación de quienes se ven forzados a abandonar su casa debido a la degradación ambiental, poco a poco vamos dando algunos pasos. El Acuerdo de París vinculó migración y cambio climático, y el Pacto Mundial sobre Migraciones, firmado en Marrakech hace ahora un año, plantea la urgencia de combatir los fenómenos estructurales identificados como causas del desplazamiento forzoso de las personas, entre las que se encuentra el cambio climático. Es un reto de gran alcance que ha de abordarse desde un enfoque global, porque no hay una solución única para frenar el impacto que tiene sobre millones de personas la desertificación, la degradación de las tierras, la sequía o, por ejemplo, la subida del nivel del mar. Y ese enfoque global debe plantearse además con una participación lo más amplia posible, contando con los gobiernos nacionales, los gobiernos locales, con entidades de la sociedad civil y, por supuesto, de las comunidades afectadas. Estamos ante un asunto complejo pero también novedoso, del que hoy nos van a hablar aquí dos expertos que lo conocen muy bien. Quiero agradecerles su participación en este foro, que se hayan desplazado hasta aquí. A François Gemmen, experto en geopolítica medioambiental y migraciones de la Universidad de Lieja, y a Dina Ionesco, directora de la División de la OIM de Migración, Medio Ambiente y Cambio Climático. Gracias a ambos por acompañarnos. Como saben, el formato de esta sesión es Tech Talk, es decir, intervendrá primero el señor Gemmen con una intervención aproximadamente de 18 minutos. A continuación, la señora Ionesco con una intervención también de 18 minutos. Y no nos permiten hacer preguntas. Mejor dicho, sí nos permiten hacer preguntas. Genial. Esto no estaba previsto en el guión, pero a veces es bueno que no estén previstas este tipo de cosas. Así que sí van a poder hacer preguntas. De todas maneras, yo pensaba decirles que si no era posible aquí, fuera estaríamos dispuestos, cualquiera de los tres, a atender alguna de sus demandas. Pues nada más, así que señor Gemmen tiene la palabra.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much to the Spanish government, and in particular to Mrs. the Secretary of State for Migration for organizing and hosting this event. First, I would like to stress the importance of having an event like this on climate change and migration hosted by a Secretary of State for Migration. It is, I think, a very important and significant event. I remember that some 10 years ago, when Nicolas Sarkozy was still president of France, I got in a meeting with his Minister for Human Rights and Minister for the Environment. And both of them wanted to organize a major event on climate change and migration. And both of them wanted France to take an initiative on this topic. And I remember that in the course of the meeting, I told them, well, this is very well, and this certainly would be very welcome by the international community, but you're the Minister for Human Rights, you're the Minister for Environmental Affairs, maybe we should also involve the Minister for Immigration into this. And all of a sudden they were like, oh, please no, he mustn't know anything about this. The moment he finds out that we want to take an initiative on climate change and migration, he will kill the initiative. Somehow, the minister finally got to learn about the initiative, and indeed, the initiative never saw the daylight. And I think this very much reflects the momentum that was there 10 years ago when the issue of climate change and migration was considered first and foremost as a matter of climate policy and of environmental policy. To the best of my knowledge, it is the first time that an event like this is organized within the framework of the UNFCCC by a Secretary of State for Migration. And I think this is a very important political event. So you might say, what difference does it make that it is organized by the Ministry of Climate Change or by the Ministry of Migration Affairs? It makes a whole difference, and I would like to tell you a few words about the difference that it makes to have an event like this organized by the Ministry of Migration. For quite a long time, when climate change and migration were addressed together, it was considered and perceived as a very distant threat, as a distant risk that we could avoid by reducing significantly our greenhouse gas emissions. And to some extent, still today, it is widely considered as a prop to alert on the dangers of climate change. We see it as something that will happen far away in a distant future, and as a risk that we could still avoid. And I think there is a dual problem with this framing of the issue. First, it neglects the fact that already today millions of people are being displaced as a result of the impacts of climate change, and that we're not only talking about a kind of distant, faraway risk, but we're talking about a very present, current reality that needs to be addressed right now, and that should have been addressed already years ago. And the second problem is that this framing of the issue has a tendency to fuel xenophobic prejudices against migrants and refugees. We know today, and we know the political crisis that exists in the EU about asylum. We know that in many countries, these xenophobic feelings, discourses, and sometimes acts are rising. We know that walls and barriers are being erected all around the world, and we know that public opinion sometimes is very preoccupied and afraid and anxious about migration flows. And the problem of framing the idea that climate could bring millions of additional migrants and refugees to Europe or to industrialized countries is likely to fuel even more these xenophobic concerns, and is likely to fuel hostility against current migrants and refugees, and make it even more complicated to find common solutions and a common policy on migration and asylum. This is the reason why I think we need to stop considering climate change and migration as a kind of distant threat that would be brought upon by climate change, to address it as a current phenomenon that needs to be addressed and that we can organize and manage to some extent. The problem so far, I would say, is that when we did consider the policy responses to migration and climate change, we considered it only from the viewpoint of an environmental policy. The initial responses were about providing some form of legal status or updating the Geneva Convention to this, and when we saw that it was a political no-go, then we turned to the climate negotiations and to environmental policy to try to address the issue. And of course, we've made very important progress in that direction. In 2010, the Cancun Framework for Adaptation recognized formally that migration could be a powerful adaptation strategy and should be funded as an adaptation strategy. And when the Green Climate Fund will kick in next year, there will be provisions and resources to help governments implement the idea that migration could be an adaptation strategy. And there are lots of projects and programs that are already going in this direction. Most recently, the Task Force on Displacement, which was established by the Paris Agreement in 2015, tried to avert the risk of displacement, that is, the possibility that people would be forcibly forced away from their homes as a result of climate change. And last year, this task force has provided a number of recommendations to governments. And of course, these recommendations need to be implemented right now. A third policy direction that will be increasingly important in the future is relocation. Today already, a growing number of governments are relocating entire populations away from the zones that would be at risk and exposed to the dangers of climate change. You've probably seen in the news a few weeks ago that the government of Indonesia had decided to relocate its capital, Jakarta, from the island of Java to the island of Borneo. And of course, this is a massive relocation program that will be undertaken in the coming years by the Indonesian government. So very much the question in the future will be an issue of habitability. Which zones of the world will still be inhabitable? Which others will be deemed unfit for human life? And I think this is a very serious debate that we need to have. And obviously, climate change will induce some form of redistribution of the world's population. And obviously, this is a debate that we're not ready for. I mean, when a few NGO ships in the Mediterranean rescue a few dozen migrants and asylum seekers, there is a shameful bargaining going on within governments of the European Union about the allocation of these few dozens of migrants and refugees. So obviously, if a continent that is peaceful and prosperous like the European Union is so far unable to find a common solution and a common policy for a few hundreds or thousands of people fleeing desperate situations, it seems at the moment difficult to have a global conversation about a global redistribution of the population on the planet. This is the reason why we cannot have this conversation only from the viewpoint of environmental policy or climate policy. Because there is a real risk that if we don't bring in this debate, integration ministers, immigration ministers, people in charge of border security, there is a real risk of policy incoherence, that we might go in policy directions here at the UNFCCC negotiations that are completely at odds with the current debate on migration and asylum in Europe. And therefore, we can no longer have the attitude of the French ministers for human rights and environmental affairs 10 years ago, who would say, oh, do not mention this to the Minister of Immigration, because the moment he learns about this, he's going to kill the initiative. It is important right now that we bring in people who will decide on migration policy and asylum policies, and that climate change and migration is addressed not just from the viewpoint of environmental policy or climate policy, but also from the viewpoint of migration and asylum policy. We're making some progress in that direction. IOM, and Dina will talk, I guess, about this, was one of the first international organizations concerned with migration to really tackle the issue. Most recently, the Global Compact on Migration that was adopted in Marrakesh at the end of the year 2017 recognized the importance of climate change as a driver of migration and suggested a series of recommendations for intensified cooperation in that area. This is certainly a good point of departure and a good springboard for migration policies to really address this. I think that our common challenge in the coming years will be to consider that climate-induced migration is not a distinct category of migration, that it is no longer possible today to categorize migration according to the motives why people migrated, because people do not migrate for a single reason. And therefore, we need to consider climate change not as a distinct driver of migration, but as a matrix that will influence the many political, economic, cultural, demographic drivers of migration. I just want to give one example. In sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the population depends on subsistence agriculture as a primary source of livelihood. Subsistence agriculture is a type of agriculture that is highly vulnerable to any change in the rainfall or in the temperature, which means that any climate change, not even climate change, just climate variability, will have a deep and profound impact on the economic resources of half of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the reason why so many families today send one of their sons or brothers to the city in the hope that he will find an alternative livelihood for the family. And when this does not happen, many of them cross an international border and sometimes will arrive on the European shores. And there, we consider them as economic migrants because we consider that they don't come from a country that is at war. But for many of them, we could as well call them climate change migrants or ecological migrants. And it is likely that the way public opinion and governments look at them would be very different. As of today, we are still stuck in a framework dating back from the end of World War II, where we consider that we have, on the one hand, the refugees driven away from political regions, the migrants who migrate for economic reasons voluntarily, and then possibly a third category that would materialize in the future, climate change migrants or ecological migrants. We can no longer consider these three categories independently from each other. We really need to have a kind of global approach that will look at the intermingling of the drivers of migration, that will understand how these drivers influence each other, what we can do in the countries of origin to limit the causes of displacement. And for those who are migrating, very often for an array of these reasons, we need to start preparing and organizing these migration. We can no longer wait until the crisis happens, because this is at that moment that not only we will have losses of life and dire humanitarian situations, but this is exactly on that ground that populism will rise and that public opinions will be increasingly hostile towards migrants and refugees, because they will perceive this as a crisis that would be unmanageable. We need today to send a signal that this is manageable, that we have the resources to organize and plan for this migration, that we can do better to limit the causes of displacement so that people are not forcibly driven away from their homes, and that we cannot do only in the framework of these UNFCCC negotiations. We need to bring in migration policy, we need to bring in the policy fora on migration, asylum and development, and this is the reason why it is so important that this event is organized by the Secretary of State of Migration, and I want to thank her profoundly for taking the initiative. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, François. Estoy completamente de acuerdo con lo que has dicho, con tu intervención, sobre todo porque, primero, nos vamos haciendo huequecito, vamos haciendo el hueco poco a poco. Nos cuesta que el tema de las migraciones esté en el eje como debiera de estar del debate del cambio climático, porque todo lo que tiene que ver con el cambio climático al final afecta a las personas, y las personas son las que se ven forzadas a hacer esos desplazamientos forzosos. Y el cambio climático es, al fin y al cabo, el detonador de cualquier migración, ya sea económica, por la falta de recursos, o incluso como consecuencia de las guerras por falta de recursos. Es decir, que al final el cambio climático es el detonador de cualquier tipo de migración. Y creo que es necesario poner recursos para estudiar con datos, en profundidad, hasta dónde va a llegar el influjo o la afectación del cambio climático en los desplazamientos de las personas, y además estudiar normas internacionales, legislación internacional que pueda acoger este tipo de desplazamientos que, insisto, el cambio climático es el detonador de cualquier desplazamiento vinculado a las personas por una u otras causas. Nos queda mucho camino por recorrer todavía. Muchas gracias, François. Tiene la palabra la señora Ayesco.
Can you hear me? Yes, it's okay? Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you to the government of Spain, and thank you also to the pavilion of Spain. This is beautiful and very sustainable, as I can see. So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm here to present you from the perspective of an international organization, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, some perspectives on this topic, climate change and migration on the other hand. So I was really considering how to talk to you about this today, and I decided to take a few different perspectives in order to go a bit more into depth in what are we talking about when we speak about climate change and migration today. So my first way of bringing this to you today is to just speak, it may be a bit dry and a bit scarily, just about figures. We can speak about migration and climate change today as a reality in data. We know that last year 17 million people were newly displaced by sudden disasters, so floods, typhoons around the world. 17 million people. We know that over the past 10 years, 260 million people were newly displaced every year in total because of these sudden onset disasters. I can tell you maybe that, for instance, right now in Mozambique, 92,000 people are still displaced, and a lot are because of also the environmental events. I can tell you projections that, for instance, we had the IPCC report on oceans, and we know that 280 million people are at risk in very low-lying coastal zones because of sea level rise, coastal erosion, and a lot of these people might have to become migrants or relocate. So I can tell you like these statistics, it's dry, but they tell a lot, and we need the data in order to say that this is real, and also that we know that in the future, depending on different scenarios we have, it will continue. I can tell you, for instance, if we continue with 1.5 degree scenario, at the end of the century, 30 million to 60 million people in the world will be living in areas too hot to function. So we can go like this about this topic, explaining the realities of data we know. To counterbalance this very dry vision, and it's what I think it's important about migration. It's to go then at very human level and talk just about the people. So I could tell you stories from Mukmud in Mongolia, who is a pastoralist who has been displaced and had to go to the city because they lost the herds and they couldn't stay because the winters were too tough and the summers too dry. I can tell you maybe the story of Amma, who is in the Marshall Islands, who is a child and who is afraid that she won't have a country when she will grow anymore because of sea level rise. I can talk to you about Amadou in Madagascar, who is a young man in an area very affected by droughts and also who's considering maybe to move away. And I can give you stories like this that go, I think, from Spain to Moldova to Latin America, and across the world we have stories of people saying the reality of climate change and migration. Now, I would like to talk to you about this topic differently because we are at the COP. So I can talk to you about this topic in very technocratic terms. I can tell you about SDG 10.7. How far are we in achieving the recognition of migrants in the Sustainable Development Goals? I can tell you about paragraph 14F of the Cancun Agreement that has brought migration for the first time in the adaptation space of the negotiations. I can talk to you about decision 1024 of Katowice. That was last year decision dealing with displacement in the context of climate change in the framework of the climate negotiations that François just mentioned. I can talk to you about the many commitments, 23 of them, especially commitment number 5 in the Global Compact on Migration that recognizes the environmental drivers. So I wanted to speak technocratically because a lot is happening here at technocratic level, but it has a meaningfulness to it. It's not just blah, blah, blah. I really think it was key to anchor migration issues in the Paris Agreement and in the climate negotiations, and it was key to anchor climate change and environmental issues in the Global Compact on Migration. And through having them together like two sides of the same coin maybe will help us advance politically in the future. As IOM, I can talk to you very technically about climate change and migration. And I think this is key because we speak too much politically about climate change and migration, and I could speak politically, but I don't want to. So technically, it means many concrete things. It means, for instance, as a migration practitioner, for many countries, are migration policies and practices in place to face the challenges and the opportunities of climate change and migration? Are the visa regimes in place in case there is cross-border displacement to maybe have people staying, that you welcome them maybe on a humanitarian basis or maybe on a temporary basis? Is your consular service ready if your migrants are caught in a disaster to support your migrants and bring them out in good conditions? We are seeing this with Haitians now caught in the climate-related disasters in the Bahamas with the typhoons. So we can go like this and be very technical. We can speak of labor migration agreements. We can speak of pathways, legal pathways open to migrants who might move because of environmental drivers. So we can be very technical. And with the International Organization for Migration, we try to bring this knowledge and evidence base in the debate so we don't speak just in ideological and political terms about this topic, but with real data and with real concrete policy issues. I can go like this. I can talk to you about policies. Is migration and environment and climate change issues well integrated in the human rights protection space? Is it well integrated in disaster risk reduction policy, in urban policy, in development policy, in food security policy? Is it in a policy in coherent space thought through? And I could also talk to you about this topic in very legal terms. there are key questions at legal level about climate change and migration today. The Geneva Convention, you have to show persecution. You can't show persecution from climate change, so it doesn't work for climate migration. Migrants are not one legal square category at international level, so what do we do? And is a legal climate refugee or climate migration the response? And that's where I join also François. It's where we realize that we work so hard to just isolate the environmental factors of migration, to just realize that in fact loads of things are interconnected, and that the response might come just from better policies in migration in general, and not specific legal status that might be well-intentioned, but might end up by, in fact, isolating and also rejecting big categories of people. You can show you've been displaced by climate change, please come in. You can't show, goodbye. So it's very complicated. So we can speak in all these terms: political, legal, economic, technocratic, data, human stories, slogans, advocacy. All these different worlds, the academic world, all have contributed in bringing this on the space. And here at the COP now we have many, many events that deal with climate change and migration. Just want to highlight one that is tomorrow with Fiji, that we are launching the new guidelines on displacement developed by the Fiji government. And to close maybe I would like to just give you my last maybe way of talking about this topic. I've been asked by my kids, what are you working on and what is it, climate change and migration? So I had to really think it through. So I've told them a story, and I will just share the story or the beginning of it with you to conclude. So I said, you know, Santa Claus one morning went out and opened up the house, and then there was no more snow, and he realized that there were no more polar bears, and some of his elves had migrated already to the southern hemisphere, and his sledge was completely stuck in the mud. So he started thinking, what do I do? Should I maybe relocate somewhere, maybe down south? But do I have a passport to cross? Do I need a visa to be relocated somewhere else? Do I have the right? And won't I be too hot maybe in Fiji? I'm not sure I would like to lose off my cultural background of centuries of stories of Santa Claus and be in a swimming suit instead of in my beautiful winter coat. So I joke a bit about this. It's not a funny story at all, but I just wanted to say that I think we can talk about this topic in many, many ways. I hope that my organization speaks in very strong and especially pushing for migration policy and practice to better integrate climate change and migration, but I think it's the business of everyone, from kids to journalists and to absolutely everyone we know, and we can't avoid it. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Dina. Me ha gustado mucho la historia. El final también me hubiera gustado saber cuál era. Bueno, ya me lo contarás. Tenemos entonces tiempo para dos preguntas. Si alguien está interesado en hacer alguna pregunta a nuestros ponentes. ¿Alguna intervención? ¿Ninguna? Pues muchísimas gracias por su atención, porque tenemos que dar paso al siguiente debate. Gracias, Irina. Gracias, François. Gracias.